The year is 1347. Europe stands on the edge of disaster. Ships arrive in ports carrying rats, and on those rats live fleas infected with a deadly illness. Within months, entire towns fall silent. Within years, millions of people are dead. This is the Black Death. In the middle of this horror, a strange figure walks the streets. Dressed in dark robes with glass eyes and a long, bird-like beak, he carries a wooden staff. People whisper when they see him. Some cross themselves in fear. Some shut their doors quickly, hoping he will pass by. This is the plague doctor. But to the people of the 14th century, he was not a symbol of hope. He was a reminder that death had arrived. The plague doctor was not a powerful physician. He was not a man of great wisdom or advanced knowledge. In truth, the best doctors often fled when plague appeared. The men who stayed behind were usually young, inexperienced, or desperate for work. Cities and villages hired them under contract. Their job was simple and terrible. They recorded the names of the dead. They visited the sick. They wrote down how many had perished in each household. Sometimes they even prepared wills and property records because everyone knew the end was near. The most famous part of the plague doctor's image is his costume: a long black coat, heavy gloves, leather boots, a wide hat, and the terrifying mask with its long, curved beak. The mask was stuffed with herbs, flowers, vinegar-soaked cloth, and spices. Doctors believed this would protect them from bad air. They thought disease spread through foul smells, through invisible poison in the wind. So they filled their beaks with lavender, mint, camphor, or cloves, breathing through this strange filter day after day. But the costume was not a blessing. It was a prison. The glass eye holes fogged up. The beak grew stale and suffocating. Breathing was hard. The heavy coat and waxed fabric trapped heat, making summers unbearable. And despite all this discomfort, the outfit did little to protect them. Plague doctors still died in large numbers. The work itself was grim beyond imagination. Every morning, the plague doctor walked into houses where entire families lay sick. He saw the swollen black buboes on the skin. He smelled the stench of death and infection. He heard the cries of mothers begging him to save their children. He watched as strong men collapsed within hours, fever burning through their bodies. There was almost nothing he could do. Medicine at the time followed the ancient theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Doctors believed sickness came from imbalance in these fluids, so their treatments were desperate and cruel. They cut veins to let blood flow out. They placed leeches on the skin to suck away the poison. They burned herbs in the room until the smoke made the air thick. They applied strange mixtures to the skin: vinegar, onions, or even ground emeralds. Some made their patients drink potions of crushed flowers or metals. Others forced the sick to smell foul odors, believing that one strong stench could drive out another. None of it worked. The plague was relentless. Most who were treated died anyway. The plague doctor carried a long wooden stick. With it, he pointed to patients, pushed bodies aside, or even struck people who came too close. The stick was a symbol of distance, a reminder that the doctor himself lived in fear of infection. He was not a friend. He was not a comfort. He was a shadow passing through houses filled with suffering. The job paid little respect. Communities saw plague doctors as necessary but suspicious. Some believed they took advantage of the dying. Some accused them of stealing money for useless cures. Families avoided them in the streets. Even the healthy crossed to the other side when one appeared. For the doctor, life was a prison of isolation. At night, he returned to a lonely house far from the town center. Few dared to visit him. His only company was the echo of his own thoughts. He had seen so many faces that morning: children coughing blood, elderly men too weak to rise from bed, mothers praying to saints for mercy, and by sunset, many of those same faces were already gone. The mental weight was crushing. Each day was a journey through misery. Each day ended in failure. There were no miracles, no recoveries to celebrate. Only endless death. The Black Death killed between 25 and 50 million people across Europe. It destroyed cities, emptied villages and shook faith in everything people once believed. And the plague doctor walked at the center of this storm, powerless, feared. The plague doctor was not hired out of kindness. He was hired out of desperation. When disease spread through a city, leaders called for someone, anyone, willing to take the job. Young doctors who could not yet find patients often accepted. Men without much reputation or even without much training stepped forward. For them, this was a chance to earn money and perhaps gain experience. But it was also a contract with death. The agreements were written carefully. A town promised to pay the plague doctor a set salary for the length of the outbreak. Sometimes he was given food, housing, or extra coins for burial costs. Sometimes he was promised freedom from taxes while he served. But there were strict rules as well. The doctor was forbidden to leave the town until the plague ended. He could not abandon his post, no matter how dangerous the work became. He was trapped by ink on paper, as surely as he was trapped by the mask he wore. Even with a contract, payment was not guaranteed. Some cities delayed wages for months. Some never paid at all, because officials themselves died before signing the money away. So many plague doctors worked for nothing, risking their lives only to end up penniless. Despite these hardships, communities needed them. The dead had to be counted. The sick had to be recorded. Property had to be documented for inheritance. Without the plague doctor, chaos would grow worse. But the people did not welcome him warmly. They looked upon him with suspicion. The sight of his mask at the door meant a family member was about to be taken away. The sound of his boots on the street was a reminder of the grave. Children ran from him. Merchants shut their shops when he passed. No one wanted to brush shoulders with the man who carried the stench of plague in his robes. The isolation grew deeper each day. Imagine waking up in the morning, pulling on the heavy costume, and stepping outside only to feel the whole neighborhood watching you from behind closed shutters. No greetings, no smiles, only silence. A silence broken by coughs, cries, and the sound of carts carrying the dead to pits outside the walls. Some plague doctors tried to comfort the dying. They listened to last words. They wrote down prayers. They passed messages to family members who were too afraid to enter the sick room. But their efforts were small against the tide of suffering. The plague swept through too quickly. Treatment itself became a cruel theater. Patients begged for cures, but the doctor's knowledge was nothing more than superstition. He cut their veins to release blood, weakening them further. He pressed hot irons against swollen buboes, believing fire could cleanse disease. He forced bitter potions into their mouths, mixtures of herbs, vinegar, and even ground metals. He burned incense in rooms until the smoke choked the air. And when these rituals failed, he could only shrug and record another name in his ledger. The ledger became a book of despair, page after page filled with lists of the dead. Whole families erased in a week. Fathers gone first, then mothers, then children left alone for only a day before joining them. The numbers grew higher every evening. The writing hand grew heavier. The plague doctor himself was not safe. The costume offered little true protection. Fleas could crawl under the robes. Air could slip through the mask. One cough too close, one careless movement of the glove, and the infection could take hold. Doctors fell ill in large numbers, despite their precautions. Some lasted only weeks before they were carried off to their own graves. And yet, new ones arrived. The desperate need for record keepers and healers was too strong. As one doctor died, another was hired to replace him, stepping into the same suffocating mask and the same endless nightmare. The reputation of plague doctors grew darker with time. Rumors spread that some took advantage of the dying. There were whispers of doctors demanding bribes for visits or stealing valuables from houses under the excuse of fumigation. Whether true or not, these stories poisoned their image further. People began to see them less as saviors and more as scavengers, circling the sick like carrion birds. The long beak of the mask only strengthened this idea. To many, it looked less like protection and more like the beak of a vulture, a bird that waits for death, a bird that feeds on corpses. The plague doctor in his black robes came to resemble death itself. And yet, Behind the mask was still a man breathing stale herbs, a man sweating under layers of fabric, a man with tired eyes, watching patient after patient collapse before him, a man who could not remove his mask in public for fear of being cursed or driven away. The psychological burden was crushing. Every day he carried the weight of failure. Every day he walked among the sick, knowing most would not live to see another sunrise. Every day he returned to his room alone with his thoughts, wondering how long before the disease reached him too. Sleep offered no comfort. Dreams were filled with the faces of the dead. The cries of families echoed in his ears even after silence fell. The mask sat on the table beside his bed, a grim reminder of the morning to come. The plague doctor's world was one of endless repetition. Wake up, dress in the heavy uniform, walk through empty streets, visit the sick, write names, watch them die, return home, wait for sleep, repeat, day after day, week after week, year after year in some towns where the plague returned again and again. This was not a life of healing. This was a life of shadows, a life where every footstep brought him closer to his own grave. The life of a plague doctor was not only dangerous, it was also deeply misunderstood. To the people of the Middle Ages, he was both necessary and feared. He was hired to protect the town, but his presence was a reminder that death was near. He carried a staff to keep people at a distance, and soon that staff became a symbol of separation. The plague doctor was always apart, never truly among the living. His work was filled with contradictions. He was called a healer, but he rarely healed anyone. He was expected to save lives, but his methods often caused more pain. He was paid to help the sick, yet his most reliable task was counting the dead. Each contradiction added to the heavy shadow that followed him. People wanted answers. They wanted to know why this sickness had come. Some said it was punishment from God. Others said it was caused by bad air. Still others blamed strangers, foreigners, or even the alignment of the planets. The plague doctor listened to these theories, but he had no real solution. He was as powerless as the rest of them. When he walked into a house, he often found scenes of despair. The sick lay on straw mattresses. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, blood, and rot. Candles flickered in corners where prayers were whispered. Families crowded around their loved ones, begging for mercy. But when the doctor opened his bag, the tools inside were crude and useless. There were knives for bloodletting, glass jars for leeches, pouches of dried herbs, small bottles of vinegar and oils. Nothing in that bag could stop the plague. At best, it gave the illusion of action. At worst, it made the suffering greater. Still, the doctor performed his rituals. He cut veins and watched blood flow. He pressed poultices of herbs against swollen buboes. He lit fires and filled rooms with smoke. He measured pulses, shook his head, and scribbled notes. These actions gave families the small comfort of believing that something was being done. But deep down, everyone knew the truth. The outcome was almost always the same. As the weeks stretched into months, the atmosphere in towns grew darker. Bell tolls marked the passing of each new death. Funeral processions became constant until even they were abandoned. Mass graves opened outside the walls, pits where bodies were thrown in by the cartload. The plague doctor recorded numbers, but eventually even he struggled to keep up. The dead multiplied faster than his hand could write. Fear twisted into suspicion. People began to whisper that plague doctors were spreading the disease rather than stopping it. Some believed their masks held secret poisons. Some believed their presence attracted the sickness. In their grief and anger, families sometimes turned against the very men who were hired to help. There are stories of doctors chased from towns, beaten, or even killed by mobs who no longer trusted them. But the work continued elsewhere. Another town would call. Another contract would be signed. And once again, a man would don the heavy mask, the gloves, the boots, and the long coat, and step into the streets of the dying. The plague did not come only once. It returned in waves, again and again, over centuries. The Black Death of the 14th century was only the beginning. Later outbreaks struck in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. Each time, new plague doctors were hired. Each time, the same costume appeared. Each time, the same suffering followed. The costume itself became more standardized. By the 17th century, the image of the beaked mask was common. Doctors stuffed the beak with rosemary, lavender, and camphor. They rubbed the leather coat with oils, believing it could repel infection. They carried small vials of perfume to press against their noses, trying to drown out the unbearable odors of the sick rooms. They even wore wide-brimmed hats, not for fashion, but as a mark of their grim profession. And yet, despite these measures, the truth remained unchanged. The plague doctor was as vulnerable as anyone else. The disease did not respect contracts or costumes. The mask could not filter out the tiny fleas that carried death. The herbs in the beak could not fight bacteria. The oils on the coat could not block the bite of an insect. In the end, the costume was more theater than science, more hope than reality. Behind the mask, the man suffered. He sweated in the summer heat. He shivered in the winter cold. His vision blurred behind fogged glass. His breath was heavy with the stale taste of herbs. He listened to coughs, screams, and prayers from morning until night. And he knew that at any moment, one cough too close could end his life. At times, the plague doctor may have wondered if his work mattered at all. Patients died. Families despaired. Towns sank into silence. What difference did one more masked figure make? But still he walked the streets. Still he entered the houses. Still he counted the names. And still he returned to his lonely bed, to wait for another day of the same grim ritual. The loneliness cannot be overstated. Cut off from normal society, shunned by healthy neighbors, feared by everyone he met, the plague doctor lived in a kind of social exile. He was necessary but unwanted, needed but hated. A man who spent his days with the dying and his nights with no one. The mask itself became his identity. Without it, he was a nameless physician. With it, he was a symbol of fear. The mask stripped him of humanity, reducing him to a bird-like figure, faceless and cold. Children remembered the sight of the beak more than the man who wore it. Adults remembered the dread more than the medicine. The costume swallowed the person inside. This was the true curse of being a plague doctor. Not only the risk of death, not only the endless failure, but the loss of identity, the erasure of self. He became an image, a warning, a shadow. He became part of the plague itself. The plague doctor's life was not only a battle against disease, it was also a battle against fear, ignorance, and superstition. People in the Middle Ages had little understanding of medicine. They looked for causes in the heavens, in the ground, and in the sins of mankind. Astrologers claimed the plague came from the alignment of planets. Priests said it was punishment from God for human wickedness. Common folk whispered that it was spread by strangers, foreigners, or even witches. In such a world, the plague doctor stood at the crossroads of science and myth. He carried the weight of both expectation and blame. When patients begged him for healing, he tried his methods. When families demanded hope, he gave words of comfort. But when his treatments failed, anger quickly followed. It was easier for people to believe the doctor had failed them than to accept that nothing could be done. This anger sometimes turned violent. Doctors were insulted, shouted at, or driven away. In rare cases, they were attacked in the streets, their masks torn from their faces, their robes burned. Communities that had once begged for their help now saw them as a curse. And yet other towns continued to hire them, for despite the failures, there was still a need. Someone had to record the names of the dead. Someone had to write down the wills of those who would not see another day. Someone had to keep order in the storm of chaos. That someone was the plague doctor. Their contracts reflected this grim reality. They were not measured by how many lives they saved. They were measured by how many records they kept. by how faithfully they stayed in the town until the outbreak ended, by how well they carried the mask of death without running away. Money was often poor reward for such service. Some contracts promised gold, but delivered little. Others offered food or housing, which quickly ran short during the famine that followed plague. Still, for many desperate young men, it was better than nothing. A small income, even in the shadow of death, was a chance to survive. The world around them grew darker with each passing week. Church bells rang so often that people stopped counting. Funeral chants became background noise, part of daily life. Priests, once called to comfort the sick, often refused to enter plague houses. Gravediggers demanded high pay, for their work was more dangerous than ever. And through it all, the plague doctor walked on, mask forward, staff in hand, a ghost among the living. Inside his costume, he carried a small book. It was filled with observations, symptoms, numbers, the progress of the disease. In some cases, these notes later became valuable records for history. But at the time, they were little more than lists of sorrow, names and dates one after another like stones laid upon a grave. The physical exhaustion was great, but the mental exhaustion was even greater. Imagine walking into a home each morning knowing that by nightfall, half the people inside would be dead. Imagine speaking with a patient, writing down his will, and returning the next day to find his bed empty. Imagine watching children waste away in front of their parents, powerless to stop it. This was the rhythm of a plague doctor's days. Sometimes, out of desperation, he tried new remedies. He experimented with stronger herbs. He burned strange powders. He pressed ointments of mercury or arsenic onto wounds. Each experiment carried its own dangers, poisoning as often as it healed. But with death all around, any attempt felt better than none. At night, the doctor lay in bed with the mask beside him. The long beak pointed toward the ceiling like a silent reminder of his role. Sleep did not come easily. His mind was filled with images of the day. The cries of the sick echoed in his ears. The smell of death clung to his nostrils, even when he tried to breathe fresh air. The weight of failure pressed upon his chest. And always beneath the surface was fear. Fear that tomorrow would be the day the plague reached him. Fear that one mistake, one careless moment, would bring the sickness into his own body. Every cough he heard made his heart quicken. Every ache in his muscles made him wonder if it was beginning. The plague doctor lived in the constant shadow of his own death. Years passed. The plague did not vanish. It returned again and again, striking new towns, killing new families. With each wave, the costume appeared once more. The beaked mask, the leather coat, the staff, symbols of a job that no man truly wanted, but many were forced to take. To the people of Europe, the image became unforgettable. Even centuries later, the plague doctor remains one of the most haunting figures of history. Not because he cured the sick, not because he offered miracles, but because he walked calmly through the darkest hours of human suffering, powerless, faceless, and alone. As the centuries moved forward, the shadow of the plague remained. Outbreaks struck again and again, in Italy, in France, in England, in Germany. The cycle of fear repeated itself. Each time, new plague doctors appeared, wearing the same costume, carrying the same staff, and facing the same impossible task. By the 17th century, the plague doctor's image was fixed in the public mind. The beaked mask was no longer just clothing. It was a symbol. It represented fear, death, and helplessness. Artists painted them into scenes of disaster. Writers described them as figures of dread. Children whispered about them in the streets. The very sight of one was enough to make the healthy flee. Yet behind the symbol there were still men. They still sweated inside the heavy robes. They still breathed the stale herbs inside the beak. They still watched helplessly as patients died around them. Their lives remained trapped in the same cycle of duty, isolation, and fear. Some doctors tried to rise above the misery. They wrote long accounts of what they had seen. They described the symptoms carefully, hoping future generations might learn. They noted which towns were struck hardest, how quickly the disease spread, how long it lingered. These writings would later help historians understand the scale of the Black Death. But at the time, they were little comfort. The people still died. The plague still returned. The doctors still failed. And failure weighed heavily on their souls. To be called a healer, but to heal no one, was a burden few could carry with pride. Many doctors abandoned their work after one outbreak, unable to face it again. Some fled, breaking their contracts, risking punishment, but saving themselves. Others stayed too long and paid with their lives. What was it truly like to be a plague doctor? It was to live in constant discomfort, trapped inside leather and wax. It was to breathe through a beak filled with rotting herbs. It was to see death at every doorstep, to count it, to record it, but never to stop it. It was to be feared by the people you tried to serve. It was to be accused of corruption, of greed, of spreading the very sickness you wished to avoid. It was to be forgotten as a man and remembered only as a mask. No true victory ever came. When plague ended in a town, it was not because of the doctor's work. It ended when the disease burned itself out, when there were no more victims to infect. The doctor packed his mask, closed his ledger, and left. The people buried their dead, rebuilt their homes, and waited in dread for the next wave. That was the rhythm of plague life in Europe for centuries. Over time, medical science improved. Microscopes revealed the world of bacteria. Germ theory replaced the old ideas of bad air and humors. Vaccines and antibiotics eventually gave humans weapons to fight disease. But all of this came long after the age of the plague doctor. For him, there was only ignorance and superstition, only herbs and smoke, only bloodletting and failure. And so history remembers him not as a savior, but as a symbol. The long dark coat, the wide-brimmed hat, the glass eyes, the curved beak filled with lavender and rosemary, a figure that walked among the dying, powerless and feared. It truly sucked to be a plague doctor. It meant living as an outcast, working in constant danger, and watching endless death without the power to stop it. It meant being trapped in a costume that dehumanized you, that made you a vulture in the eyes of the people. It meant knowing that your work was more about counting corpses than saving lives. And yet, in their own way, plague doctors left a mark. They were the witnesses of one of humanity's darkest chapters. They wrote down the names so the dead would not be forgotten. They described the horrors so future generations would know what had happened. They stood in the storm when others fled. They endured when there was little reason to endure. But their endurance came at a terrible price. Loneliness, fear, failure, a life lived in the shadow of death. The mask of the plague doctor has survived into our own time. It appears in art, in theater, in festivals, in horror stories. It fascinates us because it is both strange and terrifying. It fascinates us because it represents a truth we all fear, the truth of helplessness in the face of death. When we look at the beak and the dark robe today, we see mystery. We see something eerie, something almost unreal. But for the men who wore it, there was nothing mysterious about it. It was heavy. It was hot. It was suffocating. It was a cage they carried on their bodies. And inside that cage lived an ordinary man, forced into an extraordinary nightmare. A man who wanted to be a healer, but became instead a symbol of despair. A man who wanted to fight disease, but became instead a companion of death. A man whose name was forgotten, but whose mask became immortal. This was the reality of the plague doctor, not the romantic figure of legend, not the mysterious shadow we imagine in costumes today, but a tired, frightened, lonely man. A man who lived among corpses. A man who watched history's darkest disease up close. A man who proved more than anyone else that it truly sucked to be a medieval plague doctor.